Hi CC, welcome to week 19 of your timeline. You are officially in the final quarter of your CC year, and it's been about a year since I worked on these videos. So, sorry if I look different. Our first card this week is Lincoln's War Between the States. This is what Americans call the Civil War, and it was fought between the northern states, the Union, and the southern states, the Confederacy, between 1861 and 1865. Now, a civil war is what happens when two groups in the same country fight each other. There have been civil wars all over the place and all across the timeline. Notably, there were some very famous civil wars in England called the English Civil Wars. But this is the American Civil War. Thankfully, it's the only one we've ever had, officially. So just once again, to make sure you have it straight, this war is fought between the northern states in the north, called the Union, or the United States of America, and 11 Confederate states in the South, the Confederacy. These were states that had seceded from the Union. They'd left the Union. By the way, leaving the Union is a very big deal. We are the United States of America. That's our country's name. And most would argue that we are stronger, safer, better when we all band together, when we stay united. So leaving the Union had huge consequences. We really shouldn't say they left the Union. We should say, they left the Union! They left the Union! It's a big deal. So what were they fighting about? Slavery. Yep, it really was slavery. President Abraham Lincoln was a passionate abolitionist. That means he believed in fighting for the freedom of enslaved people. However, it was also about more than slavery. It was also about economics and power. Notice how I get just a little bit uncomfortable and uncertain as I describe all of the reasons behind the Civil War. That's because people in the North had a very different experience of the war than people from the South, including enslaved people from the South, who also had a very different experience of the Civil War. And in fact, those two halves of our country, or you might say three sections of our country, three people groups, still learn different versions of the history of that war even today. The people of the South, the southern states, they lost the Civil War, and in many ways, they still bear the scars of that today. While the North continued getting stronger and prospering and getting better after the Civil War, the South had been totally destroyed. The South fell generations behind in terms of their development. They were spending years and years just recovering. Their cities were burned down. Thousands of their people were killed. In fact, we have a whole period of U.S. history called Reconstruction, which we'll learn about next, which was just all about trying to rebuild the South and trying to recombine those southern states back into the Union and building up the Union again. Even today, when all the buildings have been rebuilt and most people don't have any firsthand memory of having lost a relative in the Civil War, you can still see sort of cultural scars in the South. For example, the South was once known for gentility, for manners, for high culture, for art and architecture. Now, when a comedian or an actor wants a really quick shorthand for how to make someone kind of dumb, they immediately reach for a Southern accent. That still happens today, and many would argue that's because of how backward and behind people in the South were starting right after the Civil War. One thing that's important to note when we're talking about this really tense issue is that many people in the South who fought in the Civil War never owned slaves, but they still had to take arms and fight in a war. It was that or stand back and watch their families be murdered. This is why you might still, in some sources, hear the Civil War referred to as the War of Northern Aggression, because for people in the South, that's how it looked and felt. So, how did this whole thing start? Let's say it started in about 1860. That's when President Abraham Lincoln was elected president. But was he elected? See, Lincoln became president based almost entirely on votes from Northerners. Southerners did not want him as their president, partly because he was an abolitionist and he was not going to let them keep enslaving people. So they voted against him, and he won anyway. And they were really upset about that. So upset they didn't even want to be part of the country anymore. Does this remind you of anything going on lately? You might say the war began in the Senate, because senators started leaving, just abandoning their post. These were Southern senators who wanted no part of this government any longer. They left, and they drafted the Articles of Confederation. It's more complicated than that, but that's basically what happened. So many Southern senators left that eventually the Senate of the United States didn't even have enough people. They didn't have a quorum. They didn't have the minimum number of people required to make decisions or pass laws or get anything done. So these Southern senators basically shut down the U.S. government, And then, again, they all banded together and said, we're going to be our own country. We're seceding from the Union. They left the Union. And we're now the Confederacy. One major question about the Civil War is, who attacked first? It's a pretty big deal that you know who started it, right? But do you count the election of Lincoln as the start of the war? Do you count the senators leaving as the start of the war? I mean, they were allowed to secede. That was sort of written into the Constitution. They weren't required to be part of the U.S. if they didn't want to be anymore. So them leaving probably wasn't the start of the war. It all came to a head around a place called Fort Sumter. This was a port in Charleston Harbor, so it was really important for trade, for protection from naval attack. It was a really big fort, an important fort for the people of South Carolina. Now, the Northern government still wanted this fort, and the Southerners said, absolutely not, no way, Fort Sumter is ours. It's part of South Carolina. We own it now. We left your country. Bye-bye. The North did not agree. They gradually started stocking that fort with food. Then they were seen unloading rifles. Then they disguised their troops as civilians and sneaked all their own troops into the fort, like in the middle of the night. So was that how the war started? Now, eventually, the Southerners, the Confederacy, decided we are taking back this fort. It's our fort. It's on our land in our new country. The North can't have it. And they fired. So officially and absolutely, the first people to fire in the Civil War were the Southerners, the Confederates. To put it in terms some of you Star Wars fans may understand, the South shot first. But did they start it? In their minds, the North started it by coming in and taking over their fort. What do you think? By about a month later, President Abraham Lincoln had added roughly 23,000 soldiers to the regular standing army of the U.S., and he did this without approval from Congress. So some feel that he was doing what he wanted and that he was being a bit of a rogue president and that he was taking over in a way that caused harm. Others feel that he was just passionate about abolition and freeing enslaved people. They also believe any action of his would have been justified given that context. He was trying to free the enslaved. There were numerous battles and events during the Civil War, but there are just three that I want you to remember. The first was the Battle of Antietam in 1862. So many lives were lost that at this point there was no going back. We were definitely all the way at war. Then, on January 1st of 1863, President Lincoln enacted the Emancipation Proclamation. He had made it public and announced it to everyone in the year prior, but it took effect on January 1st, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. All enslaved people were given emancipation, which is freedom. And the Emancipation Proclamation also declared or proclaimed that any state not obeying it, not freeing the enslaved, was now officially at war with the Union. And lastly, you should know about the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. This was just an especially bloody battle and is considered a major turning point in the war. So the fighting went on until 1865, and during that time, villages, towns, cities were burned to the ground, and anywhere from 650,000 to 850,000 lives were lost. That many people died. Now, many in the South still argue to this day that the Civil War never should have happened. They feel they were bullied and murdered into rejoining the Union, which is not really a good pathway to one big happy family. Many of them feel that the South would eventually have ended slavery on their own, the way many, many countries across the world did in the next decades. However, would they have ended it? Remember, the South's entire economy was dependent on slave labor. We learned this way back in the beginning when we talked about Jamestown down in the South and Plymouth Colony up in the North. The North had trade, they had industry, and the South had agriculture, and to make that work at the time required very cheap human labor. They needed slavery to keep doing what they were doing. Would they really have ended it? Would they have given up their economy out of the goodness of their hearts? Would some of them have given up their slaves but not others? How many? How many more years of slavery would be worth the cost of 650,000 to 850,000 lives? The math of that is really difficult, and the morality of it is really difficult. Now, ultimately, the Union states in the North won the Civil War, and the Confederate states in the South rejoined the Union. And the enslaved people were officially freed, leading to the beginning of recovery for this much abused people group. many of whom would leave the South during the Great Migration of the 1900s in search of new opportunities and new lives for themselves. Some in the South still have a feeling of loss surrounding this era, a feeling that many innocent lives were taken, and a feeling that maybe they would have been better off as their own country, as the Confederacy. Many still believe there's something unique and special about Southern culture that's different and separate from Northern culture. You'll see people of this mind sometimes flying what is known as the Confederate flag. It's also called the Dixie flag, the Southern Cross, and the Rebel flag. For them, this flag represents everything that was good about the South going its own way and being its own culture. But for the North at the time, and for many people in the States today, that flag represents one thing: slavery. So which is it? Should Southerners be allowed to carry that flag if it means something else to other people? What do you think? To create the motions for this card, we're first going to do a sign for Lincoln. Now, we could do the ASL L, but unfortunately, culturally, this has come to mean something negative. Some people do this to mean loser, and I have way too much respect for President Lincoln to use anything even remotely like that to help us remember him. So instead, we're going to remember his wonderful, tall stovepipe hat that he would wear. So we're going to do Lincoln. Give us a very tall hat. Lincoln's War, and between the states, instead of doing our normal war sign that we've done over and over and over again, let's remember this was a war between the North and the South. So let's do between the states. So we've got Lincoln's War between the states, and that's it. Our next timeline card is Reconstruction of the Southern States. Now, starting in the middle of the Civil War, in 1863, right after he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, President Abraham Lincoln began putting plans in place for Reconstruction. He wanted all the Southern states to come back to the Union. He wanted to fix things in the South for African Americans, and he eventually just wanted peace. So he began putting plans in place to make this peace happen. One of the big questions at first was, when do we officially let a Southern state back into the Union? At the time, the states were just sort of prisoners. They were like being held at gunpoint by the North. But eventually, the first sort of decision was that if about 10% of the population would vote to join the Union, then it could be suddenly back in the Union. Some people opposed this, and there was a great deal of back and forth and compromise taking place. In 1865, the war ended and Reconstruction officially began. But in that same year, President Lincoln was assassinated at a theater in the middle of a play. The actors were killing it that night. So Lincoln was no longer president when Reconstruction began. Instead, that duty first fell to President Andrew Johnson. Not Andrew Jackson, that's something else. Andrew Johnson. So they wondered, how do we do this? How do we reconstruct a country after so much bloodshed and destruction and loss and social upheaval? What do we do? In particular, how do we ensure that African Americans, the newly freed people, really are treated as Americans? How do we protect their new status as freed people? What do we do? Right away, the wealthiest of the Southern plantation owners tried to get the newly freed African Americans to sign labor contracts. In these contracts, they were required to stay and work for an entire year at a time for very low, uncompetitive pay. Basically still slavery. Then there was the question of voting rights. How could we tell these African Americans that they really were Americans if they still didn't have the right to vote like other Americans did? Other American men. And then, of course, there was the question of the military presence of the North in the South. Northern soldiers were still stationed there. They still had the cannons and the guns pointed at the Southerners. It's hard to feel like you're welcomed back into the family and you're all one big happy country when one side is still pointing guns at you. But at what point do we pull the soldiers out? How many of them should we pull out? How quickly? It was a slow and complex process. But by 1870, all 11 of the Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union. There are a couple of terms you should know about from this period. One is carpetbaggers. These are people from the North who eventually made their way down to the South and sort of took over and helped establish a new culture and system of authority down there. Many people in the South resented them. They were like, hey, you aren't even from here. You're not Southerners. How come you're down here running everything and running the businesses and making all this money off of us? So carpetbagger is kind of a negative term if you're from the South. If you're from the North, it just means you saw an opportunity and you took it. Picture them carrying great big suitcases, big bags made of carpet filled with all their stuff and just moving into the South. Like, hello, we're here to stay. Those are the carpetbaggers. You should also know about the scalawags. These are people from the South who had been loyal to the Union the whole time. So some people in the South kind of saw them as vile betrayers. That's why they call them scalawags. They also had a big role to play in rebuilding Southern culture and being in charge of businesses and kind of running things, since the North trusted them. So we got the carpetbaggers coming down from the North and the scalawags who were already in the South. Now, another group of people to have tremendous influence on the rebuilding of the South, when some people don't realize this, was African Americans themselves. 16 African Americans served in the Congress during the Reconstruction period, and about 600 more African Americans served in state legislatures. There were many positive things to come out of Reconstruction. One of them was the establishment of the first free public schools in the South. Another was the strengthening of the railroad system. One of the most positive things was that huge tracts of land were set aside for the express use of African American farmers and planters. And this period also led to the establishment and the strengthening of African American churches, which remained huge centers of culture for African American communities even long after Reconstruction ended. One of the most horrible things to come out of this period was the Ku Klux Klan, or you might have heard them called the KKK. You may also have seen photos or videos of Ku Klux Klan members wearing long, pointed white hoods. Ostensibly, the Ku Klux Klan began as a social club, one that only admitted men, white men. But it later revealed itself as a terrorist organization that specifically sought to punish and murder African Americans for any perceived slight against white people. The next Reconstruction president was Ulysses S. Grant, and he was president when the 15th Amendment was passed. The 15th Amendment made it illegal to deny any American citizen the right to vote based on former slave status, or the color of their skin, or their race. Please note that that was only applied to men. Women of any color were still not allowed to vote. In many ways, Reconstruction was successful. The enslaved people were freed. They were given the right to vote. And the government put policies in place so that those rights, those new rights of African Americans, could be defended with force if necessary. But in other ways, Reconstruction failed. The formerly enslaved people were often the victims of new discriminatory laws that kept them poor and kept them on plantations, this time as sharecroppers who still didn't have any mobility or ability to leave or rise above their situations. This one was really sad because eventually all that land that had been offered to them, 40 acres and a mule, eventually a bunch of it was just taken back again and given back to white landowners. Some now see this period as an unsuccessful attempt to control Southern culture. Some think the country was just exhausted and couldn't handle any more change, even positive change. Others see it as a kind of train of change that just ran out of steam. And that train didn't get going again until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. To create the hand motions for Reconstruction of the Southern states, we're going to build something up. Reconstruction. Reconstruction of. And for Southern states, give me an S, crossing your thumb in front, and drag it down to the South. The Southern states. Altogether, that's Reconstruction of the Southern states. And that's it. Up next is Dominion of Canada, or as the song makes it sound, Dominion of Canada. The phrase Dominion of Canada comes from Canada's official title. It's officially the Dominion of Canada, but that's almost never used. Most of us just know it as Canada. It was first used during Canada's official Confederation on 1st of July, 1867. Notice that I said 1st of July and not July 1st. This is because in some parts of Canada, the date is written in the British format, and in other parts it's written in the American format. So just out of respect for those parts of Canada, let's say that Confederation happened on 1 July, 1867. Confederation is the system by which several originally separate colonies of Canada combined into one entity. Originally, there were only 3 colonies involved. It was New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and the Province of Canada. Not long after, the Province of Canada was cut into 2 separate provinces. We now know them as Ontario and Quebec. Eventually, Canada went from those 4 original provinces to the 10 provinces and 3 territories that we know in Canada today. One of the most important things to come out of Confederation was the Constitution of Canada. And something interesting to know from this time is they almost called it the Kingdom of Canada. But the American Civil War had just happened, and the British were very nervous about using the word king anywhere in North America. They definitely didn't want to have any more conflict with those former colonists of theirs in the Americas. So instead of calling it the Kingdom of Canada, they called it the Dominion of Canada. Many say that this name was inspired by a passage from the Bible, from Psalm 72. It reads, "He shall have dominion also from sea to sea, and from the river unto the ends of the earth." So you can sort of think of that passage when you imagine all of Canada stretching from ocean to ocean, sea to sea. Now you may remember that Confederation happened on 1st of July. So that day became very important to Canadians. By 1869, it had become an official holiday. And every year on the 1st of July, Canadians still celebrate this coming together. Only they no longer call it Dominion Day. They just call it Canada Day. This change happened in 1982, the same year that formal official ties with Britain were cut, and Canada became an independent nation. Ever since then, the 1st of July has been known as Canada Day. To create the sign for Dominion of Canada, first spread out your fingers as if gathering a wide area of land together. Dominion of. Then you're going to give a thumbs up and tap your chest twice on the same side of your body as that hand. So it looks like this. Canada. Altogether, that's Dominion of Canada. I just love this sign for Canada. Next up on our timeline card is Otto von Bismarck unifies Germany. Now, you just learned about Canada unifying a bunch of colonies into one powerful country. This week, we're learning about the Germanic states unifying into one powerful country. All of this happened over the course of about 20 years, from 1851 to 1871. And the person who did the most to cause this unification was a man named Otto von Bismarck. And by unifying Germany, he set the stage for World War I. That's why it's so important that we have this event on our timeline. One of the things we have to consider when we talk about the unification of Germany is German nationalism. Long ago, there were over 300 different Germanic states, basically little communities who ran themselves and had their own authority. But after the Napoleonic Wars, the Council of Vienna condensed them to 39 states. And some of the Germans were thinking, hey, why don't we all get together and be one really big country? We all speak German. Germany, Germany. They were very passionate. They were nationalists. The 2 biggest Germanic states at the time were Austria and Prussia. But Austria and Prussia were always fighting one another. Austria, Prussia, Austria, Prussia. It was an intense battle. But poor Prussia could never really get the upper hand because some foreign powers had decided that Austria was going to be in charge. Actually, Austria kind of decided that Austria was going to be in charge, so Austria was like, thank you, Austria. Oh, you're welcome, Austria. And Prussia said, hey, what about Prussia? Prussia did begin to get more powerful as it began to unify with neighboring regions, neighboring Germanic states. So that's sort of the war that's going on, the war of ideas. Who will be in charge? Who can gather the most Germanic states to be the biggest region? Basically, everybody in the region agreed, we need to somehow get together. But they differed in their opinions as to how they should get together. There were 2 big theories regarding German unification. 2 big ideas or ways they might have gone about it. One was called Großdeutschland, or Big Germany, Big Deutschland, and that one was going to include Austria. And the other was called Kleine Deutschland, or Little Germany, and that was going to be everyone else getting together except Austria. That's how you deal with a bully. So the first really successful union was an economic one called the Zollverein. Zoll comes from the word for toll, and Verein means union. So the Zollverein, the union of the tolls. It was a little bit like the European Union, the EU, in that all the little German states were allowed free trade with Prussia. They were all just going to act like they were one big happy country, or more like one big daddy fish with lots of little German fish, but I digress. This gave Prussia a lot more power, more of an ability to apply pressure to Austria. There was so much conflict happening at the time. All of these outside powers had been swooping in and controlling the Germans, and the Germans were like, we've had enough. No more outside people controlling us. Germany for the Germans. Germany, Germany. There were violent revolutions happening, and finally all of the revolutionaries got together in one place, in Frankfurt. At the Frankfurt Parliament, they drafted a constitution for one unified Germany. It was going to have 2 branches of government. They had a whole plan in place, and they offered the crown to someone and said, here, be the king of Germany, the new unified Germany. And he said, no, or nein. So that big first attempt at unification failed, but there was still all this unification energy in the air. You could argue that part of why that first attempt at unification failed is that it was based on ideals, and it wasn't very realistic. So enter an incredibly realistic politician, and that was Otto von Bismarck. He was the prime minister of Germany. And what Otto von Bismarck believes in is not highfalutin ideals. He believes in power, authority, real results. And he has a whole theory of politics surrounding this. He calls it the realpolitik. And that's what he wants for Germany. Real power, real results, not ideals, even if it means we have to be kind of schemy. One of the ideals that was really popular in the world at the time was socialism. In theory, socialism is the idea that everyone comes together and they share everything equally. But in practice, what socialism tends to mean is that the government runs all the businesses, takes everyone's money, and then kills the people who don't agree with them and don't do what they say. I will admit to some personal bias here. I'm not a big fan of socialism in practice. Much like Otto von Bismarck, I think it's a beautiful theory that often leads to bloodshed in practice. So you'll have to study up on socialism and decide how you feel about it. So Otto von Bismarck sees that socialism is in the air and the socialists are trying to rise to power, so he does something really tricky. He starts Germany's first social welfare program. Not because he's a socialist, he's not, he's completely against it, and not because he has socialist ideals, but basically because he wants to keep the socialists from coming into power. So he outmaneuvers them. He out-socialists the socialists. He provides old age pensions for everyone living in unified Germany. He provides workers' compensation for everyone in the new unified Germany because we had all of these new factories. It was the machine age, the industrial age, and people were getting injured. He also provides health insurance for everyone in the new unified Germany. So he makes all of the socialist-leaning people happy, and he gets rid of the socialists. Next, he needs to make all of the liberal people happy. The word liberal applied in this context, it doesn't quite mean what it would have meant in the US, but basically these German liberals wanted to be free to live their own lives. They didn't want government interference, so they weren't really like the socialists. But one thing they wanted was to get rid of the Catholic Church. The church had had this stranglehold on Germany, and religion was very powerful, and the church was sort of running things like a business or like a government. And the liberals were saying, we're sick of this, we want them out of here, we don't want a country run by the Catholic Church, we want to be our own country, we want to be liberal. So Otto von Bismarck starts something he calls the Kulturkampf, the culture war. And he really pushes back against the Catholic Church and gets their powers reduced. So the liberals are happy. Can you see how Bismarck is playing both sides? Now, the socialists all like him, and the liberals all like him, and these are groups that formerly were fighting against one another. Now they're coming together as one unified Germany, and they're uniting under Bismarck. But do you notice how Bismarck doesn't really believe in either one of these things? He's supporting the socialists because it's politically smart. He's supporting the liberals because it's politically smart. That's realpolitik. That's his theory of government. One more thing that Bismarck does is brings all kinds of new machinery into Prussia. He says, hey, we need to be more involved in the industrial age. Look at these cool factories they've got in the countries next door. We need to be a modern superpower. So let's get all the new technology in here. He helps to sort of catch Germany up on modern technology. Now, Bismarck wasn't just doing things on the home front with the Germans. He also had big plans for gaining power outside of Germany. He very much believed in war and that real power could only come from war. In fact, one of his most famous sayings is that power could only be achieved through iron and blood, or now we tend to say blood and iron, but that wasn't the order of his original phrase. So what does that mean? Blood and iron. It means war and conflict and machinery and strife. And Bismarck believes that through those things, he's going to end up with a much stronger, even more unified Germany that is a world power that the world takes seriously. Is anyone else feeling like maybe something bad's about to happen? So Bismarck leads Germany in 3 big war efforts. They were bloody, they were violent, and they led to German unification. And I won't get into them too much, but they had a lot of blood and a lot of iron, and they were called the Wars of German Unification. The first war is basically fought against Denmark, and by the end of that war, every single German state either belongs to Austria or Prussia. They're just building up their empires. And remember, Bismarck is from Prussia. He wants a strong Prussia. He wants to take down Austria, or at least envelop Austria. So now that we've got these two sides built up, the next war is between Austria and Prussia. And they call it the Austro-Prussian War. So that's easy. At this point, you can think of it as Germany in the north, that's Prussia, and Germany in the south, that's Austria. And much like in the American Civil War, it was the North, Prussia, who beat the South, Austria. Stay with me, we're almost done. The next war is the Franco-Prussian War. And in this one, Germany in the north and Germany in the south band together against a common enemy, France. And they just dominate France. They march into Paris and take over the city. It's a huge military victory for Germany. After all of this war, Germany is finally officially unified, and they announce this standing in the middle of France's Palace of Versailles in the famous Hall of Mirrors. So to show that they've taken over this foreign country and to show how powerful they are, that's where Bismarck announces German unification. He calls it the Declaration of the German Empire. One more thing they did at this time, other than setting up major future conflict with France, is that Germany sort of annexed, or just stole, a German-speaking province in France that had always been part of France. Because remember, they want all the German-speaking peoples to be one country. So whether this province wanted it or not, they said, hey, you thought you were German-speaking French people, but now you're German people. Germany. And they just kind of stole that region. Can you see how we're laying the ground for a lot of future conflict? They also forced France to pay over 5 billion francs in reparations for things that had happened in previous conflicts and wars. So France was not happy with the situation. So many of the events of this period point the way to World War I and World War II. For example, the way that Germany dealt with conflict at home or issues going on at home was to just attack a foreign nation. That is something they stayed pretty consistent about. Also, when you look at everything Germany did to France, how much it insulted them, took over their prized city, stole their people, stole their money, it definitely helps to explain why France was so vengeful and angry later on. Another interesting fact that feels sort of darkly prophetic is that on the day Germany announced their big official German unification, they had the largest standing army on Earth. I wonder what they were going to use it for. Any big plans, Germany? No? To create the first sign for this card, we're going to do Unifies. So bring your hands together and connect them like links in a chain. To create the sign for Germany, we're going to link our thumbs together and spread these fingers like the wings of a bird. This is the large bird on the German flag. So all together, that's Otto von Bismarck unifies Germany. That's it. Up next is the Boer Wars in Africa. The Boer Wars happened in South Africa, but it wasn't called South Africa at the time. In fact, it wasn't even its own country at the time. Back then, in the late 1800s, the region of South Africa was still a British colony. It might help you to know that the word Boer means farmer in both Dutch and Afrikaans. And that sort of encapsulates this war. We're talking about Dutch Afrikaans farmers fighting for their independence from Britain. Most students know about the East India Company, which is this powerful British trading company that's so powerful it's practically its own country. They have their own flag, their own military sometimes. They're incredibly powerful. Well, the Dutch East India Company is the Dutch version of the same thing. A long time ago, back in the 1600s, members of this Dutch East India Company had been shipwrecked in the region now known as South Africa. But they found it really easy to survive. The land was so fertile and rich. They fell in love with the land. After they made it back home, they came back to South Africa, purchased land from the local Khoi tribe, and got permission to live there basically as Dutch settlers who had agreed to farm the land. And these farmers, these Boers, these burghers, these cattle raisers, they became the foundation of a major Dutch colony in Africa. Now, they'd purchased the land legally, they had permission to settle there, so they were supposedly now free landowners. But it didn't quite work out that way. Now, I say these people were supposedly free landowners because the Dutch East India Company, also called the VOC, which, trust me, makes sense if you read their name in Dutch. The VOC, the Dutch East India Company, was really controlling about these people and their lives. They imposed heavy taxes. They declared what things the farmers were allowed to plant. For example, they controlled what the farmers were allowed to plant, and they demanded a large percentage of the crop back in the form of taxes. Now, many of these Dutch colonists began as indentured servants. Many of them were fleeing religious persecution, or they just wanted a chance to start a better life for themselves and especially for their children. And they thought by becoming landowners in this fertile new land that they could do that. So they would sell themselves as indentured servants. They would say, basically, East India Company, Dutch East India Company, you own us. You own us for 5 years. You own us for 7, 10 years. And after that, we're free. The problem is that the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, engaged in some pretty nasty tactics and dealings with this people. For example, they would free them, but in the fine print on the document that said they were free, it would basically say they could be pressed back into service whenever the company had need of them. And this also applied to their children. So these people who thought they had bought a better life for themselves, who had worked for years to earn their freedom, were basically learning that no, in fact, even their own children have now become enslaved to this very powerful Dutch company. So again, we have children being born into a kind of indentured servanthood ticking time bomb that can just go off at any time, and these children will be required to get on ships and go away and do whatever the Dutch East India Company commands them to do. So understandably, all these Dutch colonists are really sick of the control. They're not just tired of it, they're being deeply harmed by it. So they want to get away from this Dutch authority and break free. Now, part of how they accomplish that is by moving further and further and further north into Africa, which many of them could do because instead of planting crops, they were herding cattle. So they just had to move their cattle further and further and further north to get away from Dutch authority. But you can see how this might have caused conflict with the locals, the Africans who didn't want these Dutch colonists grazing their cattle on their land. So the stage is really set up for a lot of future conflict. I don't want to paint these colonists as completely innocent, virtuous victims. They weren't. Many of them were slave owners themselves. And some of the laws they were trying to escape by moving further and further north into Africa were laws about slavery and how you were allowed to treat people who were indentured to you or enslaved to you. Being enslaved is always awful, but across history, the Dutch have been notoriously awful, extra awful to the people enslaved under them. So we're talking about Dutch colonists who want a better life, but who have also made life awful for people enslaved under them, and now they're escaping further and further north into Africa to get away from Dutch authority. In the midst of all this conflict and turmoil, the British land their ships in the region now known as South Africa, and they start taking control of the region. All of this happened at the very end of the 18th century, so like 1795. The British land, and it's really easy for them to take over because so many of the enslaved Africans come running to them and say, please, please take over Britain. It's really awful. We hate the Dutch. We'll do whatever you want. So the British took over and the entire region became a British colony. But the Dutch were really unhappy under this British rule. For one thing, the British had started founding missionary schools to educate the Africans. So now these African peoples could really speak and advocate on their own behalf. They were becoming movers and shakers. They were pushing back against Dutch authority. They were freeing themselves. The British also passed laws requiring the Dutch to treat slaves more fairly, more humanely. I don't know how slavery can ever be humane, but trust me, it was extra inhumane under the Dutch. For example, one of the new laws said that you couldn't torture a slave for disobeying you. Also, the idea that we should just end or abolish slavery altogether had been picking up steam in Europe and picking up steam in Britain. And the Dutch were worried it was going to come all the way to their colony and then they wouldn't have any slaves at all. The British even started a policy of paying the Dutch for every slave that they freed. But the Dutch didn't feel that the payment was high enough. By 1834, abolition was finally successful, and every person enslaved under British rule was declared free. But these Boers, these Dutch colonists, I want you to keep remembering that they're called the Boers. These Boers were just fine with slavery, and they depended on it for their livelihood. So they said, no way, Britain! And again, they escaped Britain by moving further and further and further north up into Africa. But who owns that land? Other African tribes. They can't just take it over. So there was more conflict. This situation led to war after war after war. The First Frontier War, the Second Frontier War, the Third Frontier War, the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Frontier Wars, the Seventh, Eighth, and Ninth Frontier Wars. Can you see why we just call them the Boer Wars? Eventually, many of these Boers just left the British colonies altogether. They officially declared themselves free and separate and started founding their own colonies. And that was kind of working for a while until the British discovered diamonds in Africa. And then suddenly having really tight control over as many regions of Africa as possible became a much bigger deal. You've probably heard of the gold rush in California. Well, now you've heard of the diamond rush in Africa. Everyone was flocking to Africa to get in on the diamond action. And pretty soon, Britain started annexing, which just means stealing. Britain started annexing all of those little Dutch colonies that those escaping Dutch Boers had set up for themselves. Britain just said, this colony's ours now. Our colony, our colony, our colony, our colony. So Britain was controlling everything, but it was controlling people who didn't want to be controlled. Now, they made the announcement of this annexation in a city called Pretoria, and that's where the conflict really started. In your studies, you may encounter a song called We Are Marching to Pretoria. We are marching to Pretoria. It's a song that was popular with soldiers on both sides of the conflict. And these are just the frontier wars. We haven't even gotten to the Boer Wars. It's a lot of wars. So there was all this tension. It was like a powder keg ready to explode. And the thing that caused it all to explode, the start of the First Boer War, was a farmer on a wagon. This Dutch farmer had brought his wagon into British territory, and the British demanded that he pay a tax on the goods in the wagon. The tax was higher than he'd been expecting, and he said he couldn't pay it. The British confiscated his wagon and said, we're going to auction this off. We'll sell everything you own, and that will pay the tax. So they were going to leave the farmer with nothing. The Dutch colonists had finally just had enough. They stormed the auction site. They got the wagon back for this farmer and gave it to him. And then all heck broke loose. The conflict was violent. The Dutch colonists were killing British soldiers. The British soldiers were killing the Dutch colonists. And the war was on. One interesting thing to know about the Boers, these Dutch colonists, is that they'd been living in Africa for a long time. They were familiar with the terrain, and they were used to hunting for their dinner. So they wore clothing that camouflaged them in the African bush, and they were used to lying in wait and taking a single accurate shot to try to take down a wild animal. That's what you have to do as a hunter. You don't want all the animals to get scared away. You don't get more than one attempt. So for years, they had been training themselves in accuracy. This is very different from the British military. They wore bright red uniforms. They were trained to stand in a line and for everyone to fire at the same time. So despite the fact that Britain had incredible military might, the Boers were often successful fighting against them. Sometimes, if they knew a battle was about to begin, these Boer farmers would get down in the bushes with their guns, and they would watch to see where the British officers were, and they would fire their guns and kill the British officers before the conflict even started. Another famous story is the Battle of Majuba Hill. What happened in that story is that the British had crept up this hill in secret. The Boers were camped down here at the base of the hill. So the British crept up to the top of the hill, and then some of the officers stood up and started shaking their fists and yelling down insults at the colonists. And typically in any military situation, whoever is at the top of the hill has the advantage. They're the ones who are going to win the conflict. Anybody else has to fight uphill. But in this battle, the British stood up, started shaking their fists in their bright red uniforms and insulting the colonists down at the base of the hill. So from the base of the hill, the colonists just shot them all, and then the battle was over. It took 30 minutes. So these battles and wars, the Boer Wars, went on and on and on. And eventually a truce was reached in 1881, which just blows my mind because that's the same year when Impressionism is happening. So imagine Degas, Renoir, Monet, and they're all painting beautifully in France. But in the back of your mind, you should hear, "We are marching to Pretoria." All of that conflict was happening at the same time in South Africa. So it had been almost exactly 100 years since the British were defeated in the American Revolution, and now they were defeated in this Boer Revolution. You should know that the name Boer Wars isn't used everywhere. The British call these the Boer Wars, but the Boers at the time called them the Wars of Independence. They were fighting to be free, so they could enslave people. And today they're also sometimes called the Anglo-Boer Wars. Eventually, after all this fighting, a truce was reached in 1881. But wait, there's more. In 1899, so close to the year 1900, so close to the turn of the century, another war broke out. And we call this the Second Boer War. Remember that truce I mentioned? Well, the truce had basically declared that South Africa could be its own autonomous region and that the British were not going to step in and control it anymore. The problem is that a bunch of British people, thousands of British people, emigrated to the area looking for diamonds and trying to be part of this new diamond rush. So this newly formed South African Republic said, fine, you can live here, but you can't vote, you're not really citizens, you don't have any rights until you've lived here for 14 years. And the British said, that's not fair, that's awful. And they complained back to Britain and said, Britain, please come help us. Basically gave Britain an excuse to step in again. So they did. And this time they sent 10,000 troops. And not even those camouflage-wearing, sharpshooting Boers could stand up to that much military might. So the British marched into Pretoria again and took control. However, the Boers didn't give up. For 2 years, they engaged in what we call guerrilla tactics. If you've never heard that term, it basically means they used small-scale, clever sneak attacks instead of large, obvious military attacks. And this did lead them to some success against the British, until the British adopted what's called a scorched earth policy. Scorched earth means we don't care how much damage is done. We're going to burn everything to the ground. All the buildings, all the land, even land that we wanted, even diamond mines, we're burning it all down until we win. That's scorched earth. A scorched earth policy usually means harming the innocent indiscriminately. So the British weren't just fighting soldiers. The British captured over 100,000 Boer citizens, most of whom were women and children, and put them into concentration camps, where 26,000 of them died. They also imprisoned Black Africans by the thousands just to make sure they weren't assisting the Boers in any way, and 20,000 of them died. So facing these scorched earth policies, the Boers eventually gave in, and the Second Boer War ended, and once again, the entire region became a British colony. Now, of course, the Boer Wars are important history for South Africa, they're important to the Dutch, but they're also noteworthy because so many citizens around the world, including British citizens, were against Britain in these wars. People thought that the British were wrong and that the Dutch colonists should be left alone and be allowed to run their colony. People from Germany, Russia, Australia, America, even Ireland were all volunteering to help fight for the Boers. They wanted to help the Boers and they wanted to fight against the British. So the British did technically win these wars. The British won the Boer Wars. But the whole world was against them. So many see that as the beginning of the crumbling of the British Empire. To create the sign for the Boers, those Dutch farmers, we're going to do a more traditional ASL sign for Dutch. It's really the Holland sign. There's a different one that means Dutch, but we're going to do the one for Holland Dutch, which is you take your hat and it swoops down like one of those traditional curving Dutch hats. So like that. Boer Wars. And in Africa, we take one hand and trace the shape of the continent of Africa. In Africa. And if you do it in front of your face like this, some people say it means beautiful Africa. So altogether, that's Boer Wars in Africa. And that's it. Up next on our timeline is the Spanish-American War. And this is officially the first overseas war fought by the newly formed United States of America. And it's also why Puerto Rico and Guam are now territories of the U.S. Of course, like every war, the roots of this conflict stretch way back into the past, which I won't get into. Times when Spain was trying to control different colonies in the region and then either giving up, selling, or losing those colonies. But officially, this conflict, the Spanish-American War, began with the sinking of the USS Maine. Have you ever heard or read the phrase, "Remember the Maine"? Those of you who are musical theater kids might even know the line from The Music Man, "Remember the Maine." Well, that rallying cry comes from this conflict. Except the full battle cry, if you will pardon my mild but historically accurate cursing, is, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." So here's what happened. The citizens of Cuba had begun to rebel against harsh Spanish rule, and the Americans sided with them. Now, they did that partly because America was afraid that someday the Spanish would come back and try to get some of its territory back from the U.S. So America was always sort of giving Spain the side eye, like, what are you up to? Your colonies are a little too close to our country, bub. Back off. But Americans also supported the Cubans because of something called yellow journalism or tabloid journalism. There were two major newspaper tycoons at the time. One was Pulitzer and one was Hearst. And these two were locked in an intense battle for newspaper sales. They wanted to see who could be the most powerful newspaper man in the U.S. And really, across the world, plenty of people in other countries also got a hold of these newspapers. So both of these men encouraged everyone on the staff of their newspapers to use incredibly intense emotional titles that would catch people's eye, to exaggerate the details, to do whatever it would take to sell newspapers. Basically, it was clickbait before there were clicks. So both of these newspapers very much exaggerated the plight of these poor, innocent Cubans and the horrible atrocities being perpetrated against them by the horrible, wicked Spanish, until everyone in America was up in arms, like, what? We must go and save the Cubans. I mean, look what's in the newspaper. This is horrible. Americans felt very strongly on the topic, and they wanted the U.S. government to step in and do something about it. This also sort of tapped into the Monroe Doctrine, right? Like, we are not going to allow European powers to impose themselves anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. This conflict lasted through 2 U.S. presidencies, and neither president, neither Grover Cleveland nor William McKinley, really wanted to be involved in this war, but the American citizens demanded it. It was that yellow journalism. They had read so much in these newspapers, their hearts were won over. American citizens were demanding that the U.S. be involved in the conflict. So one of the things the U.S. did was they sent this armored warship called the USS Maine over to Cuba. to sort of be stationed in the waters near Cuba so that the citizens of Cuba could be protected. So in 1898, this armored cruiser, the USS Maine, was anchored in Havana Harbor, just outside of Cuba, just kind of waiting there in case something bad happened. And then something bad happened. The whole ship exploded, killing 266 American crew members. To this day, no one is certain why the Maine exploded. The Americans suspect it was a torpedo or some kind of attack from the outside, but no one saw it, or at least no one alive saw it. The Spanish say that something went wrong internally and the ship exploded from within. They've never claimed to have perpetrated that attack. Regardless of what actually caused the explosion, so many American lives were lost. And with all of that yellow journalism or tabloid journalism declaring in the papers that evil, wicked Spain had intentionally murdered American citizens, something had to be done. Once again, America was demanding that the American government fight back. One fun fact about this period was that the U.S. military wasn't especially strong at this point in history. But after the exploding of the USS Maine, once the news reached the newspapers, 100,000 men signed up to fight the next day. The U.S. officially declared war in April of 1898, and they began the Cuban blockade, where they were basically trying to force the Spanish out of Cuba. They also began attacking the Spanish in the Philippines and in the Caribbean, and by May of 1898, just 1 month later, the U.S. had basically wiped out the entire Spanish Armada in the Philippines. Eventually, the whole conflict ended with a really weirdly named Treaty of Paris. And that's because Paris was a neutral place where both countries, the US and Spain, could meet and get together to sign paperwork. According to the treaty, Cuba was now set up to be its own independent nation, with the US sort of stepping in to help out and protect it and to make sure Spain didn't come back. But along with this, the US also annexed or took over Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Now you might be thinking, wait, the Philippines aren't part of the U.S.? And you're right, the whole thing with the U.S. controlling the Philippines didn't really stick. And the fact that the U.S. paid Spain $20 million for the Philippines really made the whole thing extra yucky, and it made it look like we were just being greedy and wanting to control a territory just for the sake of controlling it. We weren't really helping the Filipinos, we just wanted the Philippines. Most American citizens were against this move. They reasoned, hey, didn't we just engage in a huge battle to fight off imperialists who were trying to take over people who didn't want to be taken over, and now we're taking over people who don't want to be taken over because the Filipinos did not want the U.S. to be in control. And this whole thing eventually led to a whole separate war, the Philippine-American War. So it took many wars and conflicts and baby steps, but eventually the Philippines did win back their independence from America in 1946, because there was a lot going on at the time. So why was the Spanish-American War so important? It only lasted 2 months, April and May in 1898. There have been so many conflicts in the history of the world. Why was this one even a big deal? 2 reasons. Firstly, it marked the end of the Spanish Empire. The Armada, the huge Spanish fleet, that mighty military might, was basically gone. You don't see Spain going and taking over places now, do ya? Nope. And it also set up the United States as a global superpower that had to be reckoned with a powerful, active presidency that was willing to get involved in foreign conflicts. And that was going to come up later and help to shape the 20th century. To create the sign for this card, we're going to do the ASL S, where our thumb is crossed in front, and the ASL A. So we've got Spanish, American, and then we're going to give that revolutionary fist pump, war. Because remember, this was a war of independence. It was Cuba's independence from Spain. So altogether, that's Spanish-American War. And that's it. Our last timeline card this week is the Progressive Era. This is the name we give to a period of American history between the 1890s and the 1920s. In this period, there was so much intellectual and technological advancement happening. But unfortunately, the real human beings involved in all of that advancement were often left behind or left to suffer. Workers were employed in overcrowded factories for very little pay in unsafe conditions. Politicians were corrupt. There was overcrowding in the cities, lack of education, and intense poverty. Again, this was at a time when wonderful progress was being made in so many areas. Elevators were being invented and faster, more widespread railway systems. Things should have been getting better for so many people, but for the people involved, it was getting worse. The progressives believed we had to make progress in the way we treated other human beings. And they led several social movements to help make that kind of progress happen. One of the things progressives did to try to help make progress in the realm of politics is they campaigned for direct elections, as opposed to just having the people in charge choose the next senators. They also campaigned for secret ballots so that each person really could vote in safety without some corrupt politician applying pressure to them and knowing how they voted. You may have seen scenes in old films of the bosses who would sort of run neighborhoods, like the Jewish neighborhood or the Irish neighborhood, and all these little neighborhoods of immigrants in America had people who were sort of running things. And they'd say, yeah, we'll take care of you, we'll keep you safe as long as you vote for our guy. So these corrupt politicians were sort of applying pressure to all of the immigrant communities to vote in certain ways. But the progressives said, hey, let's vote in secret, so no matter what kind of pressure is applied, no one will really know how you voted. Then it can be fair and you can be safe. Another one, which was such a big deal, is the progressives also campaigned for women's suffrage so that women would have the right to vote. Finally! Progressives also tried to get the truth about American politics out into the open so that everybody could know what was really happening. Magazines at the time and newspapers at the time were finally cheap enough that everyday citizens could afford them. And the journalists at the time were known as muckrakers. Basically, they combed through all the muck and brought out all the dirt happening in American politics so that it was out in the open in the fresh air and all American citizens could see it. It was progressives during the Progressive Era who passed the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendments. So they were making major political changes. In one of their more controversial moves, the progressives also wanted to make progress in American morals. For this reason, they fought for prohibition. They wanted the law to say that alcohol was not allowed. They wanted to get drunkenness and immorality out of the culture. They also set up new child-centered schools that were not just about educating children in things like reading and writing, but also about morally educating them and making them into good citizens. This led to some conflict later, but we're not going to get into it. Progressives also wanted to fix monopolies, so they campaigned for antitrust laws. I've always found this term a little confusing, so if you do as well, let's try and look at what antitrust means. At the time, monopolies had been forming so that, say, one person was in charge of all the railroads, or one person's in charge of all the oil, or one person's in charge of all the newly created electricity. When that happens, when there's a monopoly, one business can charge whatever they want and really hurt people and charge them too much money for things that should be basic necessities in a modern society. So instead of monopolies, the progressives wanted good, healthy competition. They believed if there were two people trying to sell you your oil or your electricity, that they would have to give you a good deal because they would know if one company was charging too much, you would just go to the other company. So antitrust is about anti-monopoly. These companies shouldn't band together. They shouldn't trust each other so much. They should be kept separate in smaller pieces so the American citizens have more choices. Does that make sense? That's antitrust, and the progressives wanted antitrust laws. There were some really famous, wealthy philanthropists to come out of this period. Andrew Carnegie published The Gospel of Wealth, and in it he said that if you had a lot of money, it was your duty to make society around you better by building libraries, hospitals, colleges, research institutions, museums of culture. And many people believed in what he said and followed suit. Carnegie and Rockefeller donated millions to the good of society because they wanted to make progress. They wanted to use their money to make progress. So much progress was made in so many areas. The American Red Cross was reorganized and improved so that it could support American citizens whenever they were in trouble. Booker T. Washington started major foundations to help support Black citizens. President Theodore Roosevelt made progress by founding lots of national parks so that we could always hold on to nature and to wilderness, and the sort of industrial progress would never reach into these beautiful, pristine park areas. He also started work on the Panama Canal, another form of progress, sort of progress of movement and of trade. President Wilson, his form of progress was to start the federal income tax, which not everyone saw as progress. But the point of it was that America would always have the resources needed set aside to help and support all of its citizens if something went wrong. The intention behind that was incredibly progressive. He also created the Federal Reserve System so that if Americans put their money into banks and then something went wrong with that bank, the whole thing got fire or went out of business, there would be money set in reserve to support those American citizens and get them their money back. Before that, if you put your money in a bank, it really was possible you could just lose all of it. But once we had the Federal Reserve, there was a lot more stability and people knew their money was safe in banks. Wilson also made progress by founding the League of Nations so that all of these nations could come together and start thinking of each other as more of a global society. So we weren't just having progress for America, but for the whole world. The author Upton Sinclair made progress by publishing a book called The Jungle, and it was all about the horrors of the meatpacking industry and how all the people who worked in it were treated. But once that book got out, once the muck was raked out into the open for everyone to see it, major improvements were made in that industry. Progress was made. Another thing that happened is a code of ethics for journalists was established, something that was very badly needed. Remember, we had an entire war basically because of journalism, that yellow journalism. But now we had a code of ethics to try to keep that sort of thing from happening so people could really trust more in American journalism. Maybe we need to revisit that code of ethics today. Another author named Ida Tarbell made progress by writing The History of the Standard Oil Company, which was a really powerful, really corrupt monopoly. Ida let the American people know how that monopoly, that company, was treating people, and then we were able to make some progress in that arena. So many things happened during this era. Standard working hours were reduced so that people could go home and have dinner with their families. The YMCA was started, so was 4-H, so was the Boy Scouts, so was U.S. border control. Workers' compensation was started, so if people were injured on these big, fancy, newfangled machines, they would know that their families could still be taken care of if something happened to them. So many people moved into the cities that chain stores and major shopping centers developed, where an incredible number of products was available all at once and all in one place. This had never happened before. You used to go to one person only for your meat, one person for your bread, one person for clothing, one person for metalworking goods. And you never knew what kind of quality level to expect. But with these chain stores, there was consistency. At the time, this was seen as incredible progress. At this point in history, you might think, well, that led to the death of all these beautiful mom and pop stores. So it's definitely up for debate. But as far as just having wonderful resources available to everyone, the department stores and the chain stores were a major move of progress. Business progress and efficiency made the assembly line possible. We'd figured out so many things, and now Henry Ford could use that assembly line to really affordably put together copy after copy after copy of his famous Model T Ford. And it was the car that everyone wanted to drive. And suddenly, because of all this progress and all this efficiency, many people could afford to drive it. We expanded the highway systems and people became more mobile than they ever had been before, making them more in charge of their own progress. We also had something in this period called the social gospel, and this is the way that progressivism was impacting the church. People of the church believed it was our job to make society a better place. Public education was expanded and improved, and it became mandatory. There was even new progress made in surgery, leading to new life-saving techniques. The progressive era lasted until the 1920s. It was by no means a perfect era, but by any standard, it made incredible progress. To create the sign for this card, instead of stacking our hands upward, we're going to stack them forward. So, the progressive era. And that's it. Ready to put it all together? 3, 2, 1, go!
Lincoln's War between the six Reconstruction. Okay, here we go.
Timeline, this is my timeline. Timeline, this is my timeline. Timeline, timeline. We'll start at the beginning of the ages. Age of ancient empires, creation to circa 450 AD. Creation and the fall, the flood and the Tower of Babel, Mesopotamia and Sumer, Egyptians. 3000 BC, 3000 BC. Indus River Valley civilization, Minoans and
Mycenaeans.
7 wonders of the ancient world, patriarchs of Israel. 2000 BC, 2000 BC, Hittites and Canaanites, Kush, Assyrians, Babylonians, China, Shang Dynasty, Hinduism in India, Phoenicians and the alphabet, Olmecs of Mesoamerica, Israelite exodus and desert wandering, Israelite conquest and judges, Greek dark ages, Israel's united kingdom. 1000 BC, 1000 BC, early Native Americans. Israel divides into 2 kingdoms, Homer and Hesiod. Rome founded by Romulus and Remus. Israel falls to Assyria, Assyria falls to Babylon. Lao Tzu, Confucius, Buddha. Judah falls to Babylon, temple destroyed. Babylon falls to Persia, Jews return and rebuild the temple. Roman Republic, golden age of Greece, Peloponnesian wars. Persia falls to Alexander the Great. India's Mauryan Empire, Mayans of Mesoamerica, Punic Wars, Rome conquers Greece. Roman dictator Julius Caesar,
Caesar Augustus and the Pax Romana.
John the Baptist, Jesus the Messiah. Year 1 AD, year 1 AD, year 1 AD. Pentecost and the early church. Persecution spreads the gospel. Herod's temple destroyed by Titus. Diocletian divides the Roman Empire. Constantine legalizes Christianity. India's Gupta dynasty. Council of Nicaea, Augustine of Hippo. Jerome completes the Vulgate, Visigoths and Rome. The Middle Ages, circa 450 to circa 1500. Council of Chalcedon, Western Roman Empire falls to barbarians.
500 AD, 500 AD.
Once is enough. Ah!
Byzantine Emperor Justinian.
Benedict and monasticism. Mohammed founds Islam.
Clans and early Ghana in Africa. Franks defeat Muslims at the Battle of Tours.
Golden age of Islam. Ooh.
Vikings raid and trade. Japan's imperial. Charlemagne crowned Emperor of Europe. Alfred the Great of England. Eric the Red Leaf Erikson, Norse explorer.
first of Kiev, Byzantine Emperor Basil II. 1080, 1080.
East-west schism of the church, Norman conquest and feudalism in Europe, the Crusades in Zimbabwe and early Mali in Africa, Aztecs of Mesoamerica, Francis of Assisi and Thomas Aquinas, Japan's shoguns, Incas of South America.
Genghis Khan rules the Mongols, England's Magna Carta, Ottoman Empire, Marco Polo's journey to China, 100 Years' War and Black Death, the Renaissance, China's Ming Dynasty. Age of exploration, circa 1400 to circa 1600. Prince Henry founds School of Navigation, slave trade in Africa. Gutenberg's printing press, Songhai in Africa. Tsar Ivan the Great of Russia, the Spanish Inquisition. Columbus sails to the Caribbean. 1580, 1580. Age of absolute monarchs,
Circa 1500 to circa 1800.
Protestant Reformation, Spanish conquistadors in the Americas, Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, Council of Trent, the Baroque period of the arts, Japan's isolation, Jamestown and Plymouth colony founded. Age of Enlightenment, circa 1650 to circa 1800. Hudson's Bay Company, First Great Awakening, classical period of the arts, the 7 Years' War. Age of Industry, circa 1760 to circa 1969. James Cook sails to Australia and Antarctica. American Revolution and General George Washington. Madison's Constitution and the Bill of Rights. French Revolution, Second Great Awakening. Louisiana Purchase and Lewis and Clark Expedition. Napoleon crowned Emperor of France. Liberation of South America. The War of 1812, the Missouri Compromise. Immigrants flock to America. The Monroe Doctrine, romantic period of the arts. Cherokee Trail of Tears, U.S. westward expansion.
Marx publishes the Communist Manifesto.
The Compromise of 1850 and the Dred Scott Decision. U.S. restores trade with Japan. British Queen Victoria's rule over India. Darwin publishes
The Origin of Species.
Lincoln's War between the states, Reconstruction of southern states, dominion of Canada. Otto von Bismarck unifies Germany. Boer wars in Africa, the Spanish-American War. The progressive era, Australia becomes a commonwealth. Mexican Revolution, World War I and President Wilson. Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. U.S. evangelist Billy Graham. Modern period of the arts, the Great Depression and the New Deal. World War II and President Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Stalin of the USSR and the Katyn massacre.
The United Nations formed. The Cold War, Gandhi and India's independence. Jewish state established, Mao and communist victory in China. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Korean War.
Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement.
Jim and Elizabeth Elliot, missionaries to Ecuador. The Antarctic Treaty, the Vietnam War. U.S. astronauts walk on the moon.
On the LNP. Yeah.
Age of information and globalization, circa 1970 to the present. Watergate, President Nixon resigns.
The best is au revoir.
Fall of communism in Eastern Europe. European Union formed. Apartheid abolished in South Africa. 2000 AD, 2000 AD, September 11th, 2001.
Our fellow citizens are waiting.
Rising tide of freedom, rising tide